Okay, so the next one that I want to do for our remake versus is the one I actually wanted to do first, but then time constraints kind of made me throw out Prom Night first, which is why in Prom Night I say like, oh, we're almost halfway done with this. Well, no, obviously that's not the case. So we're kind of getting to that point now, and I want to talk about these two that are exactly 30 years apart with 58 and then 88. And I guess the first thing I want to point out here is that I do have this really nice Scream Factory Blu-ray for the remake, and I don't have the Criterion Blu-ray of the original, which I'm sure I'll have eventually, but honestly, I'm not really in too big of a hurry. I have seen the Blu-ray quality version like on streaming, and it looks really, really nice and really cleaned up. But I'm just kind of attached to this DVD and how it looks because when you watch it, this particular one, it kind of looks like it's like still on film, and it was just sort of transferred to a DVD, and I feel like that fits this movie so well because it sort of feels like you're at a drive-in in 1958 watching this, and I feel like that really suits this also. But yes, I don't want to fall short of how great the Blu-ray quality version is, because the Blu-ray transfer for this one is also very, very nice. But as you would Scream Factory usually pulls that off quite well. So and their art also is really great. So with that in mind, I do want to start going into these, and I think the first thing I want to bring up about the 58 movie specifically, because it does kind of carry over a little bit to the remake, and that is the way it's part of this genre, this sort of sci-fi monster movie kind of thing, like kind of one of the ultimate B movies. And that's the thing about that, is that when you look at stuff that came later, stuff that was inspired by, you know, these sort of, I guess that now could be called cheesy sort of sci-fi movies, even though the original Blob does kind of maybe rise above that a little bit, at least as far as like how they executed their effects, certainly feels bigger than a B movie. But it still has that very specific vibe, where it feels like it's what really works, as far as it feeling like an isolated community, is the fact that it does feel like, you know, the sets are limited and the characters are limited and everything, like in the way that everything is set completely at night. Does give this nice isolated feel, but it does also give this vibe of doing as much as you can with a really low budget. I know there was a quote here from Variety about the remake where it says, "It's a great B movie with an A pig budget," is what the quote is. And I can get that vibe where it's like, in both ways I mean this as a compliment, where it's like, the remake is an A movie pretending to be a B movie, and the original is a B movie pretending to be an A movie, and it can do that because of how well its effects are executed, in the same way with this one. But the idea of that era we were talking about that seems to have inspired so many, when you watch the movies that were inspired by movies like this and that were from of this 50s era of, you know, the sci-fi movie or monster movie or whatever, it makes you want to go back to those. But the thing is a lot of those were kind of crap. Like, you can find them in like those big sort of like 50 sci-fi movies or 50 horror movie box sets or whatever you can find for like $1. And yeah, most of them are really boring shit when you go back to them. So as far as this one sort of rising above that, I do think that not only does it rise above that with effects, but there's also the fact that another thing that would make those movies kind of boring is just that famously the acting would be really wooden. So there's something very fascinating about going back to a movie like The Blob and seeing Steve McQueen being the actor at the center of it, of all people, and this kind of being like a breakout role for him. It'd be like, in any other case, if this was any of those other kinds of movies, it would almost be like this sort of moment of shame for that actor or whoever. But this one was actually like very much clearly a jumping off point for him as he broke out, especially breaking out from TV. I think, I want to say One of Dead or Alive was like pretty much around this time, and then this was kind of the start of his climbing onto the much bigger screen. And I guess there is a little bit of, like, there are times where it might be hard to buy that he's supposed to be like this teenager. I think he was 28 when they shot it, and so we get scenes like when he sneaks out after they've come home from the police station, and it's like he's in bed and his dad's like calling to him and he's pretending to be asleep, and it's like it's one thing that obviously to imagine this is a teenager, but it's like Steve McQueen pretty much looked the same from 28 forward, but just maybe a few wrinkles only being the other thing. So it does very much look like adult Steve McQueen, like in his bed, which is kind of. But I guess that also kind of adds the charming nature to it, I guess, because the movie itself is going to be going to have some dated aspects to it, just because. But like I said, as far as it. Inspiring stuff like when you see movies like Killer Clowns and stuff like that, you can see how much they really took from these movies. Like I said, this one is sort of much more of a representation, I think, of how those movies feel to watch when you're one of those directors or whoever that was inspired to make another movie. Kind of in this era, because in the 80s, we kind of reached this point, like, Killer Clowns was coming out at this time and stuff like The Stuff was coming out at this time. So it kind of felt like the perfect place for a Blob remake to come out. Because it was this case where it was like sort of middle ground where things were really embracing the cheesiness of movies from the original movies era, but they were also kind of really taking those effects to another level and also kind of taking, like, there's a tongue-in-cheek nature, but they're also taking it seriously at the same time. And this sort of era in the 80s seemed to really find like a really sweet spot there, because that's just a couple, but there's like a whole array of movies from this era that fall into this category that are especially fun to watch around this time of year. And it's worth noting that this one is from before this, he had done Dream Warriors, the third Nightmare on Elm Street movie, which is one of the best of the series. And then later on he'd be known for doing The Mask, Chuck Russell. And he also co-wrote this with Frank Darabont, and so it makes sense that Jeffrey DeMunn's in this. But also, like, as far as Darabont goes and his ability to remake things or adapt things has really shown, as he has, like, his Stephen King adaptations have really shown that he knows exactly what he's doing when he does that. So to kind of see that adaptation process that he has with this remake, kind of before all the stuff he was really known for, is really interesting to see, and you can really see where he would have a knack for it later on. And I do think, as far as where one of these is really much stronger than the other, it does feel like that, we were talking about, that A movie versus B movie feel. The remake does have a lot to work with as far as, like, characters go. What's interesting about it especially is how a lot of the characters have, like, really unpredictable personalities. Where it's like, we have Kevin Dillon here, who, like, rides up on his bike, and he's rough around the edges, and he's been arrested a lot. But then when we see him, and Shawnee Smith sees him with, like, the old guy, we do get the sense that there's this sensitivity to him, and the fact that we kind of get the sense that that's inherently in him as he goes through his sort of action hero phase throughout the movie, and kind of has an arc where he starts off as, like, delinquent criminal or whatever, to one of the heroes of this situation. Everything about that seems totally believable, and I feel like Dylan especially at this time, like, really kind of had that sort of reluctant hero vibe to him that he pulled off very nicely. But then there's also a couple of potential romances here that I love the way the movie treats, because obviously our other main character is Shawnee Smith, and she's going to be asked out by Paul, and so we set that up in one of the very early scenes, and, like, this is going to be the couple of the movie. So you've got the couple, and you've got your kind of bad boy character, and then you've got the older characters that are getting a bit more layer than they would be in another movie, where we have Jeffrey DeMunn here, who's asking out Candy Clark, and it's like, and they're kind of going through the same thing, and, like, the shyness that comes with that, and maybe the awkwardness, but the triumph when the other person agrees, and it's like, we're seeing these people go through these real emotions, which is amazing as far as character work goes, but also brilliantly sadistic because of how short-lived many of these characters will be. It's like, this is like, it's not just a case of, oh, we're just setting up characters so they can get killed off. They really sort of went as far in as they could with the character development, just for the sort of shock nature of the fact that many of these characters won't live very long. And it's like, not only does that work, as, like, it doesn't feel like cheap shock value, it feels like it works, especially since they really, really work for it. But it's also setting up that idea that anybody could die at any moment. And that becomes particularly true, especially with, there's two particular ways this movie especially stands out with a couple of its kills, and that is, we think that Paul is initially going to be a main character. Like, Paul's going to be in the position that Kevin Dillon is in by the end of the movie, essentially. And he's, like, one of the first to die. He's, like, the first to die after the old man. And then, Eddie, the little brother's friend. And it's like, by the time we got to this point, you're not really expecting them to kill a kid in one of these movies. And by the way, I was a kid when I first saw this movie. It was on, like, an on-demand channel. And needless to say, when you see a child die this horrifically, it's always going to be kind of shocking. But like I said, when you see it as a kid especially, it's going to be a scene that sticks with you. So it's really just the balls on the movie to be able to do that kind of stuff. And I love the fact that they build up that Jeffrey Demon's going to be like the cop character throughout it, so he'll be the one that's like kind of this, maybe this sort of driving force or something. And his death is so sudden and anticlimactic. I love the fact that you may not even be really sure that you're seeing him when he's dead, when it's revealed that he's dead already. So I like that they like made his badge sort of float up beside him, just to assure you this is who it is. And then killing Candy Clark in the same way, and it's like, this is going to be one of the couples that's supposed to be this. They had this really sweet moment where she like wrote it on the receipt and stuff like that. And like, you know, I get off at 11, even though it looked like she was going to turn him down. And it's this really sweet moment. And then the fact that they go out, not just in the fashion that they do, but as early as they do. And like I said, it doesn't feel like it's, you know, for the sake of getting like a cheap shock or anything like that. It feels like, oh shit, so any of these people could die now. Like, you have no idea who the main character even is, because anybody could die, because it looked like Paul was going to be one of the main ones. And then he just dies very abruptly, very quickly. And like, is one of the first. So it's like they almost kind of took like that Hitchcock approach, the Psycho approach of taking out the main character quickly, but even quicker. And like I said, and in the gruesome fashion that they do, because that's another thing that I want to talk about here as far as sort of comparing them, and that is the idea of how much is gore necessary. And I feel like this is one of those cases where when the gore actually adds to the terror of what's going on, because when you go to the original, it's like the remake is able to show stuff that they probably couldn't have even imagined in 1958. We're like, we get a taste of it with the old man's arm, and then that's about it. Everything else, we're just kind of assuming that everything's getting consumed by the blob. But the way this one, not only does it add the details, but the idea of adding the tentacles and like the acidic exterior to where like just touching it is gonna essentially kill you. I feel like they really did something here, but it's like I said, when you see them like their bodies being broken down by that acid, and it's like, that's the kind of thing where it's like it's not, it's one thing to imply a conventional death like a stabbing or something, and it's like, yeah, an audience in 1958 would get what a stabbing would look like, and you don't have to show them. Like, as long as it's implied, the audience gets the same idea, probably, that a 1988 audience would, and maybe even a better one, because their imagination has to really take over. But here, it's like, actually being able to see, like, you can imagine, like, oh, they're getting eaten by the blob, and it's like, your imagination can maybe take that so far, especially in 1958, when there's not as much insane shit that you're seeing, and a lot of it's being censored anyway. But here, to like really see full on the effect of what the blob is doing to them, that's a case where I feel like actually adding the gore can make it more terrifying and really give you the idea of what's happening to them. Because like, it would have been one thing if Eddie was just like fell and we just assume he's taken by the blob, but to see Eddie actually rise up is fucking twisted and terrifying in all the great ways that the movie's going for. And the same thing about that is also great is because even though it's, you know, terrifying and gruesome and stuff like that, it's still kind of campy in its own way also. Like, it never really leaves the campiness behind, which is great. Like, even the scene of the meteor falling out of the sky in the remake is, like, just as campy and feels as old-fashioned as it does in the 58 one. I feel like when they found ways to hang on to the stuff like that to make it feel like that, is where they really kept something special and were able to kind of do this loving tribute to the original movie while also making a whole much bigger one. Like, not saying, oh, we're remaking this because we're above this now. It's like it's sort of bringing, it feels like it's bringing the original along for the ride as it brings in more effects and more stuff to do and all that. And because I went into the characters of the remake, and the reason I wanted to bring that up also was because I feel like that's one place where the original movie kind of falls short. And it's like, because usually these older movies, you know, had the focus on characters enough, but like I said, a lot of the characters and the performance and stuff like that are just kind of boring. So, like, really the only novelty here is the fact that we're seeing Steve McQueen with that sort of, you know, confidence that he brought to the screen and that presence. And we're seeing it early on in a movie like this, which makes it very interesting. But from then on, the rest of the characters are... We don't really get many interactions like the sitcom-like scenario with Shawnee Smith's dad, Arla Flora being the guy that, you know, sold the condoms and then finds out that, you know, Paul is the one that's taking his daughter out and stuff. And when Paul wasn't even the one that was setting that up. And it's like, there's just whole scenarios like that that play out in this humorous way. And here, the characters just kind of exist. Like, we do the whole thing where they're, like, racing and the whole backwards thing. But for a lot of the characters in this, and, like, when the characters are interacting, it kind of just feels like a lot of dead air. It feels like the movie's really struggling to reach, like, feature length, because the movie's only an hour and 20 minutes. But a lot of this character interaction just feels like it's killing time. And, like, and how we were saying, like, you know, here it feels like everything kind of connects to something. Like, it's kind of... like, whenever we see the characters in the remake, it's kind of like they're putting them in a certain place that's either going to serve them as and serve the story as it goes on and how they're going to play a part in the Blob's terror and all that, or they're setting up the idea of taking the audience's expectations and throwing them out the window. One of the two things. But here, like I said, I'm not really sure what the purpose of a lot of the characters are, other than, yeah, we're establishing a community in a sense, but for the most part it just kind of feels like I said, we're just kind of really struggling to get to a particular runtime before, you know, the Blob starts to terrorize, and then when we get to an ultimate ending that gets us at an hour and 20 minutes feature length. So I do feel like they could have there's a few moments here that do stand out. Like, there's Mrs. Porter, who is, you know, the woman that's, like, trying to, you know, clean around the crime scene, and she, like, every time Steve's trying to explain what's going on, she's got something that, like, counters it. And it's in the way she has an excuse for everything, but yet she's so oblivious at the same time. There's something memorable about her. And there's the moment where, like, you know, the cops are playing chess over the radio. So, like charming moments like that. But it doesn't really feel like there's enough of those, really. Like I said, Mrs. Porter also is kind of driving things a little bit because it's making Steve's story seem more unbelievable. So they were able to make, you know, this memorable character while also having her serve a purpose. Where it's like most of the people here are just kind of here. And they link us back to the movie theater scene, I guess, some of them. But it just still feels like a lot of empty sort of air as it's going through, and it feels like a lot, like, the movie almost feels kind of incomplete. I feel like the remake feels a bit more complete when they're adding in stuff like adding another antagonist in with Meadows and bringing in, you know, the science gods and stuff like that. And, like, bringing in this whole other threat on top of the Blob itself. Almost makes it feel like it's a bit more complete, and how there's really no dead air in it at all. Especially when they make the good choice of it, because it's like, when you see this, you're like, we kind of get to a point where, yeah, the Blob is terrorizing, but then it just kind of goes into the circle until they figure out how they can stop it. And so I feel like the remake made an especially great call by using its budget to essentially turn it into an action movie for a while. Where, like I said, you're getting away from Meadows and his guy, but also the Blob is doing its whole thing. Where on top of it feeling like an action movie, it also feels like it's kind of got this slasher vibe to it, which is something that the original movie captures also. Where it's just kind of going from person to person and claiming victims. But I like the way they especially play up the slasher vibe when they insert the actual slasher movie, where it's when the movie transitions into the movie within the movie, you almost kind of can't tell right away because the movie within a movie is this typical sort of slasher movie, and it's like that's the vibe we got because the vibe we got before. With the rapey guy in the car, where like the Blob sneaks up on them, and then there's this whole thing where like this horrific moment when we see the different ways that the Blob can kill. Where I was talking about the gore factor being an asset, where it's like we see it get her from the inside. We see the guy at the diner get pulled into the sink, and it's like these things where the Blob can make the impossible possible as far as what to do to the human body. And it's like that's something that's really disgustingly appealing about this, and the fact that they can have that kind of creativity. But yeah, then it becomes an action movie, and I do love that because I feel like when you watch the remake, you could either see Kevin Dillon or Shawnee Smith as the Steve McQueen kind of character. And I like in Dillon's case how they give him the bike, and it's like, so giving him the bike kind of gives him the vibe of another very famous Steve McQueen character, and it's like the way they're kind of combining that a little bit. And it's like when you think about how above and beyond they went, because in the original they are just kind of running around, kind of looking for everybody else. And it's like we're just kind of waiting for the movie theater scene to happen. But here, it didn't seem like it was completely necessary for this movie to go as above and beyond as it does. And when I say that, I mean, like, you're remaking The Blob, which has its merits, for sure. But then when you come over here to the remake, you get the scene where, in one shot, they have the Kevin Dillon character going over the ramp, as this truck is flipping next to him, and an actual helicopter is flying over, all in one shot. And it's like, yes, movies should strive to be as good as they can possibly be, but like I said, I feel like they went way above and beyond what they needed to do, and they really wanted to make this movie something special, and that's where you get scenes like that. And that's also like this when they escape them in the tunnel also, and he's using the bike also. That's, like I said, this was probably the smartest thing they could have done, was make it a horror movie and an action movie. And there's even a bit of a paranoid element to it also, with Meadows and the conspiracies and all that stuff. So they really ran, and it's only like, what, 10 or 15 minutes longer they were able to add all this to the original movie. The original movie that does feel like it has a lot of dead space in it. Yeah, so I'm just really into that. I also, like, talking about another one of the kills, Paul McCrane, I believe is the actor's name, is in this, who plays the cop that gets folded in half and pulled in, which is another great death scene. But I also love that they were able to avoid having him be a victim of the Blob and his body breaking down, because just the year before this, he was the toxic waste guy in RoboCop. And so I kind of like that we sort of avoided something. We avoided making that actor go through the same thing. I doubt that was even intentional, but in retrospect, it's just very funny to me. So, yeah, but as far as the Blob itself goes, I do love what they're able to accomplish in the original movie, and how much it still holds up when we get that stuff. Like when, you know, he's coming through the projection booth. It is coming through the projection booth in the movie theater and that whole thing. And this iconic scene where, like, everybody's running out of the movie theater and then running down the streets. And it's this truly, truly iconic moment in, you know, sci-fi movies, monster movies, horror movies, maybe even just movies in general. And the fact that they set it up like, you know, when you're, like, especially, like, you're in 1958, and you're not necessarily expecting that the Blob is going to... They keep mentioning they're going to go to the movies, but you may or may not be actually anticipating in 1958 that the Blob will attack the movie theater, especially because that was probably a much bigger scene than they were expecting to see in 1958, as far as how the effects were pulled off. But that idea of, like, when you're watching a horror movie or a monster movie, the theater is like the safe place. Like, there's the distance, there's you, and then there's the screen, and there's there's the fourth wall in between, and so you're going to be fine overall. So it's like, imagine in 1958 you're watching this monster movie, and a movie theater is attacked while you're sitting there. I would like to think that was jarring in a really fun way, because there's still ways they can pull that off, even now. Like, there's a movie from I want to say the 80s, maybe the mid to late 80s, called Anguish, where Michael Lerner's doing things in a movie theater to people, and it's like, even now, it feels like this violation of, like, the movie theater is supposed to be the safe place while the terror is happening on screen, and as that goes on, I very much recommend that movie Anguish, by the way. That really, like, that's what the whole movie is about, essentially, is that separation. And to kind of see that in, like, its early makings here, of a movie theater audience getting attacked during a movie is kind of amazing. And the way that the Blob sort of, like, like, changes, it gets darker, and it kind of starts to look alive, like, almost like it's breathing as it goes through, and it's like, the effects, even for 1958, are pretty amazing. And then over here, you've got something similar where it's like, I especially, not only is the Blob, going to be bigger and have the tentacles and stuff like that, but the way they just add things in, like how the Blob feels like it's screaming, like it sounds like it's screaming while it's chasing them, and just adding these sort of human elements to it, despite the fact that how the tagline here is "terror has no shape." And how it's kind of hard to describe, like, why this thing would be so terrifying if you're not actually watching it. And it's like, to give it these human elements actually makes it kind of scarier and more surreal, kind of. And that's... Yeah, so as far as, like, making the Blob an actual monster, it's one of those cases where somehow it's been able to work both times, both as a campy movie from the 50s and as a campy movie from the 80s. But it's actually a very effective horror movie monster, and it's like, it's interesting. I would love to know how the pitch went as far as the 58 movie, because it's like, good luck convincing anybody, even like now, if they haven't seen the movie or really know anything about it, and why this would be a terrifying movie monster, and kind of an iconic movie monster, and it would be very hard to describe, and so to see the execution of it really feels like something special also. So I'm not sure what... I guess there's our endings. We do have the ending, the sort of, like, almost TV show ending of this one, where they, drop it off into the middle of the Arctic and say, like, the end with the question mark. Feels very beautifully of its time, and kind of has this nostalgic nature to it. I especially love the beautiful nature of the remake's ending, of the idea of, like, actually bringing snow, as it were, to this, and, like, have this moment where it actually looks like it's actually snowing, and then, like, it's crystallized and in pieces everywhere, and it's like, visually, it's actually this beautiful sort of setting, and it kind of sets in the idea of, having defeated it and everything being over, supposedly, is something that I really love also. And the idea that, like I said, both Kevin Dillon and Shawnee Smith sort of get to be the heroes of this situation. I even love the moment where, like, Shawnee Smith has her badass moment, and then dives off and gets her foot caught for a second. And it's like the fact that they're still human, but they're also, like, the big heroes of this movie. And it's an easy way to fall in love with Shawnee Smith too. I didn't like full on go head over heels for Shawnee Smith until Becker. But when I come back to this movie now, it's like, yeah, she really had this sort of old-fashioned, big presence on the screen that makes you, like, like the scene in Kill Bill 2 when he's talking about Bill watching old movies and the way he would react to, like, Marilyn Monroe and stuff like that. That sort of vibe, if you've seen Kill Bill 2 and you know what I'm talking about. But, yeah, but then also Kevin Dillon getting to be the one where it's like, he's still the big action here, but there's still, like, we've also seen him wipe out also, and it's like, we're never quite sure which one's going to reach it. And the fact that they both sort of reach the finish line here as far as stopping it, I feel like it's this great way to make sort of have like two big action heroes instead of just one. Also feels like it's subverting a little bit, which is great. But then of course we do have our epilogue, where it's like, yeah, it also has, you know, the cheesy ending we come to expect, where there's some sort of cliffhanger or something. But the way they do that here is like, even though it's this big outlandish scenario, it's still sort of scarily believable that if this were a situation that was in real life, this ending would be the way that it lives on and starts all over again. So that's exactly how it would happen. I guess the only thing I didn't mention also was talking about, like, you know, the fun and campy nature of the movie is, even though it does have, you know, it's about this terrifying monster that is eating these people, the fact that it starts with this opening song, the Burt Bacharach, Hal David song, Beware of the Blob, is one of those things where it's like, I was having a conversation with a friend actually just last year about how, like, man, do you remember when, like, horror movie characters had their own theme songs, like My Bloody Valentine and stuff like that, and it's like, that's something that should come back. And it's like, you could do something with that. So going back to that also, and the original movie having all this feel, and like I said, me not wanting to abandon this DVD because I love the idea of, like, feeling like I'm in 1958 when watching this movie, and, like, at a drive-in and stuff like that, where it feels like the perfect setting for something like it. But I will get that Criterion Blu-ray eventually. But yeah, so I do think that's pretty much what I have to say about these. And I do prefer the remake. I think not only just because it really ups the effects and stuff like that and adds, you know, other aspects like the Meadows character and stuff like that, but like I said, the main thing that does the original in for me is just how it feels like there's so much dead air in it. And how, like, the characters just kind of feel like we're kind of getting us nowhere for a while. And it doesn't even feel like character development in any way. It's just literally like we're killing time to make sure we get to feature length. But when it does something well, it does it very, very well and still holds up now, which is great. But even if it does look like, you know, a dated effect or whatever, there's always going to be a charm to that. And same thing for movies from the 80s also. And anything from that era, like I said, like The Stuff or Killer Clowns or whatever, where it feels partially intentional but also partially taking itself seriously. And that's kind of a good place to be, especially for stuff like this, and why there's tons... And it's a whole rabbit hole I suggest you go down. Or find a friend that knows, like, all these, you know, forgotten 80s horror movies. Because there's so many that are a lot of fun in there that if I hadn't found a certain friend of mine, I probably wouldn't have known about a lot of them. So I would highly recommend that also. So I think that's pretty much it for this one. The next thing we're going to do is talk about Stephen King, which of course is one of my favorite things to do. From where Mr. Harrigan's Phone was turned into a movie for Netflix this week. And then after that, we'll have one more remake talking about, I believe it's the 70s and the 2010s. And then we'll have a couple of new reviews, like Amsterdam and the Woman King, and then all the horror movies, Barbarian and Pearl and Smile, and the new Hellraiser, The Invitation. I think that's it. Will be its own video also, and then we'll continue on with Remake Versus and whatever else comes up. More Stephen King stuff for sure. Yeah, so until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.